Well, happy, beautiful, amazing day. Dr. Bob Rakowski here with Dr. Sarah Farwell and Dr. Matt Zatonski. They are co-founders of Solution Makers, a health and life coaching consultancy focusing on optimizing brain health, cognitive performance, and long-term fulfillment, which I'm excited to talk about all of those things. And interestingly enough, part of your bio, it says you bridge clinical and practical strategies, use supplements, use pharmaceuticals, and even where legal, right, you use some level of psychedelics as well, which, by the way, there's a lot of amazing research on there. But maybe we start with the backstory. How did you get started? One of my favorite topics, optimizing brain health, brain chemistry, cognitive performance.
Mhm.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Bob. It's great to be here. And, brain health from the physical performance side. I'm an athlete. I've done a lot of fitness training. It's been my outlet and my hobby for my life. And it it's just like building a muscle. There's an aspect of brain health that is you can't expect yourself to walk into a facility or training ground one day and then suddenly bulk up in one session, right? It takes a lot of work and a lot of mental toughness and stamina. So I've been seeing what that looks like on the field, in the gym, teaching people, and when we talk about brain health as far as what it really takes to build your mental muscle, I kind of come at it from that perspective, and it takes consistency, it takes effort, it takes reward, so all of those things that we kind of put into practice that I think for most people might be a little intuitive, right? A walk doesn't have to be elite athlete. It could be any sort of movement that is just as much about the brain as it is the body. So we kind of that's one aspect that we bring into our practice together. But maybe as far as like what cognitive performance is and what the foundation of it is, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, dive in. But even before you do that, what was your sport and how far did you take it?
Oh, I played soccer or football, and I played all through high school, and then changed to racquetball in college.
Interesting.
Yep.
All right, and then I do ask my athletes, and I don't know how many hundred elites I've asked, how much of the game is mental? 0 is not at all, 100, it's 100% mental. I'm gonna ask you both. What at the elite level, how much of the game is mental versus physical? How would you answer that?
I would say 90% mental, 10% physical. Yeah.
Dr. Matt, how about you?
I would, if it comes to answer to your question, I would agree with this. 90% is mental, but also that's because physical performance is mental.
You know what? I like the way you both said that. I've asked athletes, some have said as much as 100%, and I said, "Come on, it can't be 100%, you gotta have the physical gifts." And it was an NFL linebacker, he said, "At our level, we can all play physically, it's the mental game that separates us." So, interesting there. So, all right, so if we're gonna talk about brain first coaching, what exactly does that mean? And what's the best entry point for most people? Is there one?
Well, yes, happy to start. So brain first, I think the quickest way to summarize this comes from a 2000-year-old quote from Marcus Aurelius. The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. And I think that's the quickest summary of the importance of your cognitive ability and its influence of your entire life. Because whether we want this or realize this or not, our brains govern everything that happens in our life. How we perceive it, what we achieve. Humans are not significantly different. Everybody wakes up with 24 hours every day, and it's the brain that decides what happens and drives our behaviors and actions during that time when we're awake.
So
That's it. Our life is our brain.
I like that. Now, there's people that have said for years, and I don't know how we verify that, but somewhere on, do you have a feel for how many thoughts we have each day? How many of those are a repeat of yesterday? How many of those are negative versus positive? And does it really matter, or do we just like wipe the slate clean and start over? Well, how do you address those issues?
So the short answer is it not only it matters, it's the only thing that matters. Your entire worldview depends entirely on what your thoughts are. And people have a tendency, we all have a tendency to associate what appears in our conscious brain with our egos, with ourselves. But it's not entirely the case. We have very little control over what the next thought is that shows up. And what shows up is typically dictated or brought to surface from the subconscious mind. And what is repeated happens or gets reinforced. And as you said at the beginning, we have of this question, we have a significant tendency to repeat the thoughts today that we had yesterday and the day before and the day before. Pretty much all of them. And without realizing that this is happening in the first place, or that self-awareness of where the thoughts are coming from and what they are, we are unaware of how they shape our entire life.
And as far as, the number of thoughts, people say an estimate of a couple thousand thoughts a minute. And if you put that into perspective, like presidential speeches are about 6,000 words over the course of an hour, let's say half an hour to an hour. So think about how many thoughts are actually really going on. And when we talk about the thoughts that you're now aware of, and whether they're positive or negative or not, those are the ones that are maybe the loudest, or the ones that you're choosing to pay attention to. So, negative and positive is really just your interpretation of your own thoughts. And I know that maybe sometimes uncomfortable for people to really understand or accept, but there's always a flip side to something that's negative or that you think is more negative. There's always a positive. This isn't about find the silver lining. It's not that. Do you understand what your interpretation of it is? Negative and positive really isn't a real thing, right? What do you choose to do with that thought after? Does it make you do something or not do something? Does it make you repeat something or avoid something? That's the question. Because those thoughts, like you said, they shape your world, they shape your reality, whether you realize it or not. So that's where the power of not just, because you cannot control your thoughts, but you can choose to interpret them differently and then choose to do something different in the real world when you notice those thoughts coming in.
Can you give a practical example, maybe?
Please share.
How that would work? So Sarah talked about the thoughts that we are aware of or we become aware of. So they're brought from the thousands of subconscious thoughts a second into what we become consciously aware of. But there's a whole mechanism, software that runs underneath that we are often unaware of unless we learn and pay attention or learn to recognize it. I think a good example is something common, let's say procrastination. Procrastination is a default mode in which our brains work. There's a software in the back of our brains that tries to preserve the energy. The brain consumes 25% of the body's energy and oxygen consumption. That's a huge, huge demand that the brain requires us to give to allow it to function. Now, it means that for most of us, everything that reduces energy spend or cognitive drain, as we call this, will be prioritized if possible. So your brain will not create a new pathway or will not like you to make any extra effort if necessary. And a very easy way for the brain to stop you from acting or doing something is pop up a thought into your conscious memory that will prevent you from doing something. And you get rewarded for that as well. So, for example, there's a difficult task you have to complete at work, or a boring task you have to complete at work, and it's 3 months away. Instead of forcing yourself to do something that is not really comfortable or easy, your brain will say, "Well, you have plenty of time. You're good. It can wait. There's something more important going on. There is this." There will be thousands of little tiny thoughts that will be coming to your attention, and you'll be saying, "Yeah, maybe I will not do this," and then you get an immediate reward for this. So you move away the uncomfortable and you get a little bit of dopamine and it keeps you in that loop.
Yeah.
by default. So this is an example where the subconscious software or subconscious scripts pop up thoughts into your conscious brain that prevent you from acting to preserve your energy. Because the brain's primary function evolved to keep you alive. And part of keeping you alive is reducing the cognitive drain or the amount of energy required to keep you alive.
So is that somewhere along the line of what Carl Jung used to teach, that until you figure out the subconscious and bring it to conscious, it'll direct your life and you'll call it fate? That's kind of what his quote was. So we've got to somehow bring this to the surface and own it and even
Yes.
control it. Is that the strategy? I hadn't heard as procrastination as a brain defense mechanism, but it makes really, really good sense.
So yeah, the Jungian interpretation is a simple interpretation, right, without the in-depth neuroscience and mechanisms going on what was observed. So to some degree, this is correct.
Yeah.
So now you use a lot of different tools, supplements, different nootropics, psychedelics. So, how do you choose what you use, what combinations, how long? What's your strategy there?
Mhm. So this is probably something I should take as well. So it's a very good question. So let's start with, so I specialize in pharmaceutical medicine. This is my second medical specialty, which is the science of how different substances impact the body. And we are a complex chemical and biophysical organism that heavily relies on other chemicals that are being put into our body. And whether this is an apple, an egg, a steak, or a pharmaceutically produced compound, it will have a biological impact on what's going on in our bodies, right? What we consume impacts our metabolism, impacts processes that are happening in our body, gives building blocks that are required to produce compounds, for example, that are necessary for the brain to function in the right way. So it's not just pharmaceuticals, it's pretty much everything that we eat and consume as well that has an impact on how our bodies and brain functions. And those things have much more impact than we often want to admit. A lot of people would say that what they eat or what they choose to eat or whether they can stick to certain dietary regimen depends on their willpower. But we know this is not true, right? A lot of those things are driven metabolically and we later explain our behavior, but oh, I didn't have enough willpower, I'm not strong enough, I'm not good enough. But that's purely because of the choices you have made earlier in the day without realizing what the metabolic impact of that would be. And the same holds true for pharmaceutical compounds. So everything we take has an impact on how we function. And pharmaceuticals have been used in helping people function for a long time. We do not advocate, in general, using brain impacting pharmaceuticals pretty much for anything, because although they have a measurable effect, they typically treat the symptoms. So let's take anxiety, for example. We're a society that is obsessed with symptoms. And I have learned this in medical training. And in the society, we tend to manage the symptoms only and nothing else. Hardly ever we look for the reason for a moment. So it's like, imagine you break a leg and you take painkillers because it hurts without trying to do anything to immobilize and let the leg heal.
Mm.
So a good example would be anxiety. We're a society that if you go to a doctor, you'll be prescribed with anxiolytics, which are the group of class of medicines that keeps you less anxious by changing the chemistry of your brain. And while they do have a mild effect, they do not help to solve the underlying problem. And over time, they become an effect. They don't solve anything because they're not treating the root cause of the problem. And they only work while the drug is present in your brain or in your bloodstream. So the moment you stop taking the drug, everything comes back. Some often in a kind of a rebound form, in a much more symptomatic way, because you haven't addressed the problem and you change the chemistry of the brain. That's not the way to deal with this. So yes, we do specialize, or I do specialize in the how pharmaceuticals work, but it doesn't mean that we recommend or prescribe them often. Our work often is the opposite. We try to take people off those compounds and give them tools and allow them to function without. So learn how to address the problem so they can function without them.
I think that's brilliant. I don't know if you're familiar with Kelly Brogan, but she was a conventionally trained psychiatrist, wrote a book, about how she was so disappointed with the medical approach to mental health challenges. So if we go more towards the natural realm, do you have some favorite supplements, nootropics, even psychedelics if you were to mention your favorites in those categories, what would they be?
Well, I think when it comes to when we supplement or if we even add any compounds onto if someone is really prioritizing their brain health or let's say for longevity and trying to slow the decline of cognitive performance because that's an inevitability for aging. So there really isn't something to take or experience that will do it for you. So there are, we try to recommend that you build those habits for movement, for sleep, and for rest for your brain, separate from sleep first. So if you're not getting, general macro and micronutrients in your everyday diet, that does matter as you age, of course. There's metabolic effects of that. So supplementation is really just that. It's not replacement of what you would normally be getting from your diet. So that's one thing. And maybe in the field of, longevity, we see this trend of people maybe haven't actually chewed their food in months because they wake up and they take this or supplement series or smoothies or whatever they do, and that's fine. But the brain needs rest, it needs movement, it needs blood flow, it needs oxygen, and it needs sugar. So I don't think, I mean, I know there's evidence that for certain supplements, if they are clean, because that's also another part that maybe Matt can talk more about, because not all supplements are the same. Um, like just consuming as little processed sugar as possible, eating real sugar, fruit, even is a really good thing for the brain. Berries are good for the brain. Healthy fat, good for the brain. That's kind of we try to educate and and appreciate getting those natural nutrients in your everyday diet before you would just go to a supplement in general. And in I think for people who might be exploring the psychedelic realm, that's for maybe a completely different that wouldn't necessarily be for, a maintenance. We can talk about that in a second, hopefully.
Yeah, well, the psychedelics, those are certainly interesting. I'm gonna add Matt back to us. I don't know where he went away, but as long as we have this moment, this episode is brought to you by bettercoffeeshop.com, a better choice, the world's cleanest coffee, best organic coffee, tested for herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, molds, mycotoxins, metals, and coming up cleanest in all categories, and infused with 100% USDA certified organic reishi mushroom, bettercoffeeshop.com. Well, now we have a little different orientation on the screen, at least my screen. So, Dr. Matt comments on one. I agree 100%. We should be addressing our brain with diet, exercise, sleep, lifestyle. One thing I do want to say, sugar seems to be America or maybe in the world's drug of choice. And there are people with seizure disorders where we want them to be on a ketogenic diet, which, by the way, I'm not aware of any downside for the brain with ketogenic, but you're right. For quick thinking, and that's why we go for sugar so much. We get a dopamine boost from a sugar hit. But Dr. Matt, did you want to comment on some of the supplements, nootropics, or even psychedelics?
Yes, gladly. So I think Sarah just gave a very good overview of how eating certain compounds impacts how our brains functions. And yes, you're right. So although the preferred source for energy for our brain is glucose, so it's sugar, the brain can synthesize. We have mechanisms that allow us to get the required amount of glucose from other sources. And yes, you're absolutely right. There's solid evidence that certain types of diets, for example, ketogenic diet, can be beneficial for people with seizures. There are also benefits for certain types of brain tumors as well. and so on. So, but that's individual specific, right? That depends on an individual, and so those interventions need to be tailored. I wouldn't probably give a blanket recommendation. And when it comes to impact of medicines on brain, most of them will have some impact on how the brain functions. But let's take what's currently being trendy. So psychedelics. So psychedelics are at the moment in clinical trials realm being rekindled from trials that have been stopped in the 1950s, primarily for political reasons. But those compounds now are getting are coming back into the public spotlight because they have dramatically positive, proven positive benefits on brain function, not only in management of certain conditions, but also in improving overall well-being or allowing our brains to learn or relearn, recreate certain neural pathways that have been formed in the past. I think the best way to describe the impact of certain psychedelics on the brain, I use this ski slope analogy, which I think it's illustrative and it helps people to understand. We form behaviors by repetition, and the stronger the impulse or the situation in which a neural pathway or connection has been formed, or the more time it has been repeated, the more likely we are to do this. When we learn a bike, it takes a while, but then it becomes automatic. We don't have to think about every step that we take. Same thing for driving a car, meeting or choosing a romantic partner, or things to eat, or how we behave at work, and so on and so on. So those neural pathways shape pretty much everything that we do in our life. And the more we repeat them, the more persistent they become. Imagine you are trying to ski down a slope, and the first time you do this, and one time is enough, there's a trail that is being left. And then when you put yourself in the same place over time, they become deeper and deeper and deeper when you repeat and you go down the same pathway. And after a while, when you are standing on the top of a hill, you can just do nothing and you will follow the previously carved path. And that's how a lot of things are happening in our brains without us even realizing it. And at some point, it becomes difficult to take any different route or any different path because your ski are so deep in the snow that it's still possible to take a different path, although it's extremely difficult. And what psychedelics tend to do, psychedelics are like the snow blizzard that falls and fills in those gaps with fresh snow so that you can relearn or easily choose new pathways or new ways of doing things. We depend on the environment, so it's not enough to take psychedelics to have a meaningful change in life. You need to also work on changing your environment, have someone who can help you with new thinking patterns, show you a different way. So it's not something that we can often do ourselves, but assisted psychedelic therapy is now proving to be extremely beneficial for not just for managing certain conditions like anxiety, depression, addictions, PTSD, and any traumatic events from the past, but also for general well-being, learning plasticity, ability to create quickly new behaviors with relatively little side effects if done with correct support and environment shaping.
I love that analogy. So, we've talked about autopilot. We talked about the default motor network, or mode network, I believe is what they call it. And then different researchers, some will say as much as 95% of our day is on autopilot. The default mode network study, I thought they said 48%, so almost half. But there's pros and cons to autopilot. There's things that we do automatically that are quite good for us. We probably want those on autopilot. But will the psychedelics overwrite that too? Do you have to reform good habits as well as rewriting over the bad? Have you found that to be the case or no?
So yes, you do need to build new habits because the old ones still exist. It's just much easier to start forming them. And you form new habits by repetition. You're right. A lot of us can spend 100% of our day living on autopilot. Every day looks exactly the same. And the older we get, the more of our lives can be completely on autopilot without us even realizing that. No, there's nothing wrong with this in principle because we need to be able to run on autopilot. Otherwise, it would be cognitively too draining, right? If imagine every time you get to the car to get to work, you need to think about, every time you shift brake, like it wouldn't be possible. So we need to form these behaviors, but at some point, some of them may become maladaptive. They no longer serve us. We need to change them, but nobody teaches us how to do this. And the other problem that we have, or a challenge that people face, is that we tend to build our identity around our behaviors. So, for example, for some reason, let's say you have started smoking because you couldn't resist the pressure of your peer group, and you become addicted to the substances that are in cigarettes, to nicotine, which makes you repeat that behavior. And over time, no matter what information you will receive about how bad smoking is, you might be well aware of this, you'll continue to engage in that behavior kind of without having you have an illusion of control, but you're still smoking. You tell yourself you can stop anytime, and you start to build your identity around every behavior that you repeat. Oh, I only smoke those cigarettes. I only do this in those situations. This is my preferred brand. This, I design my environment to, and not just the place where I live, but also who I stick with. What do I do at work? Where do I go for a quick break? Who I interact with, and it becomes part of me. I am a smoker. I'm this person who engages in that ritual, and you have probably a lot of good arguments that you're giving yourself why it doesn't affect your health, that you have a full control over this, and so on and so on, which tells us that our thoughts are secondary to our behaviors. Psychedelics help with this because they give you this moment of choice, the pause between the autopilot engages. And it's much easier to start building new habits or creating a new environment for yourself. But if you don't do this, if you still stick to the same people, go to the same places, repeat the same routines, you will very quickly carve with the very same pathways you had before. They never really go away, right? It's just you have a window in which you can.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing? Just to say that when someone is after psychedelic use, it's not that everything disappears or this change happens on its own or something suddenly is different, or you don't even necessarily think differently. But what you just said, the moment of pause, I think what psychedelics show for the brain is that whether the things that you do on autopilot that you think are good for you becomes absolutely clear. So it makes it, because we're also maybe getting into what drains you. Being on autopilot, like you said, Bob, is not a bad thing. You get to save the energy that you need to do the other things later, or make the more difficult decision in your day later, right? So you lay out your clothes, you wear the same thing every day. You know what you're going to eat for breakfast. You know what route to work you're going to take. You're going to, like, all of those kinds of autopilot-y things that are built in a way, those are habits. So, but if you're doing something on autopilot that is not good for you, either because it's not aligned with what you want to be doing, who you want to be around, what job you want to be doing, if there's some resistance there, the use of psychedelics, that kind of new ski slope becomes a lot more clear. So I think, people have said um, incorrectly that taking psychedelics, especially if they have the hallucinogenic effects, is like taking the pills in Limitless, the movie, and it's not like that. It's not this, there's no data that shows that. So yeah, I just want to
Well,
want to
it's
clarify.
pretty safe to say that nothing is like what they had in Limitless, right?
Yeah,
Remember
the Hollywood, and it's much harder work. Still have to.
let's talk about the hard work because I see
Yeah.
it being really hard. You're talking about rewiring people's brains who have been stuck for a while. So, what's the typical timing? Let's say you have a 30-year-old female come in and, depressed and anxious and maybe a little OCD and has a past history of PTSD.
Yep.
You know, in conventional medicine, these people don't get better. They're lifetime patients.
Yep.
But I believe this is a bridge to rewiring that can get them better. So what kind of timing are we looking at for, I know it'd be hard to say. I mean, some might be 3 months, some might be 3 years, some might be never. So what do you typically see with that?
So I'm happy to answer this.
Yeah.
So it depends on an individual, but 3 years That's way, way above of what we would typically expect. If you would put
Lady, better, faster. You for that.
you can put daily effort into something, we're looking at times in days or weeks rather than
Wow.
Yeah.
Days or weeks for the case I just described? OCD,
and
depressed, anxious, unhealthy, post-traumatic stress? Days and weeks.
yes, but no, you have now raised multiple things. So, for example, and we see this often with individuals, someone comes to us and they suffer or experience multiple symptoms that you have just mentioned. It's really difficult to start improving or changing everything at the same time. There needs to be a degree of priority. You need to choose something and stick with this. And we tend to, we're really good at finding out what's the one thing that will make the biggest difference quickly and then follow up from that quick win. But you cannot spread yourself too thin. Like you need to put, as we said, a little bit of effort into this. And it needs to be done consistently because we learn through repetition. So we typically suggest to choose one thing and start working on this. And this way we can see effects within days. 90 days, as you said, it's typically enough for people if they do it daily to build automatic lasting habits if it's done in the right way.
Yeah.
What's your follow-up over that 90 days? I mean, it sounds like you'd need multiple touch points daily to actually achieve that. Uh, but am I wrong on that, or?
I think it also depends on the person. I mean, and this is completely independent of any pharmaceutical use as well. So, our goal and maybe any practitioner's goal would be to become help that person become independent. And independent doesn't mean, oh, I don't need to check in with you and I have my own accountability. It also means you're independent from needing us to tell you that you're valuable and that that you deserve to be better. So so there is sort of this weaning, I would say, but that's by design because the more someone becomes aware and the more that they become uh, focused on what they're trying to work towards, they can accept themselves, which is a process that's not always linear either. That is the goal too. And, everybody just needs a little bit of a different way to get there. It's to use this analogy of you look at the map and you know where you want to go. We want to go from Houston to Pittsburgh. Well, you need to know that you're in Houston first, and but Pittsburgh is the destination. But there's many ways to get there. But eventually, I can hand you the map. We can hand you the map, and maybe we can get out of Houston. But then you're on your way after that, and then Pittsburgh ends up not even being maybe the destination. Something else does. So it's that's why it becomes this very deeply personal process around self-agency. And when we really start with the brain and embed sleep and nutrition and general health and the things that we can do for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we kind of flip the thinking on those short-term and long-term goals.
So, I'm looking at this, I'm saying, "Okay, 7 billion people need you." Have you found a way to scale this? 'Cause it sounds like you're doing mostly one-on-one.
Yes. And I think you're spot on. People pay us for our time essentially. And unfortunately, this is limited because a lot of that work is difficult to scale, at least the way we work with people. Not every, there is very little generic things that work for everyone. Whether this is a nutrition plan, whether this is a training plan, right? Every person needs different things in a different way, but we have this tendency to, oh, I've seen this on social media, so, and it worked for someone, therefore it must work for me. Well, that's not really the case. If it was, everybody would be thin, beautiful, and rich. And we know that's simply not the case, despite people spending time and money on those things. So
Are you able to see people at a distance? Are you able to consult virtually, or do they need to be in London?
it depends.
Okay.
It depends on what we're working on. We can do a lot of things virtually, and we do have a lot of people that we meet virtually. That is possible. And some people prefer to meet face to face. We also travel globally to our clients. I mean, we have a subset of clients that are more than happy to compensate for time and travel. We work with their chefs, the teams, the PTs, the doctors that they might have, but that's a rather elite group, or narrow group. For the vast majority of the people, we work with them as a mixture of in person and online.
You, Sarah, go.
Oh, and we're solutions makers, so we try and make the solutions simple or accessible, not easy. But we do run a platform on Substack called the Solutions Manual. So we have a lot of free resources there too, which is all about the brain and how you can, procrastination is a good example. We get a lot of people who just cannot start that thing, and we have something to help them with that. So we try to educate in that way, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you
Yes,
see any?
we do have hundreds of resources for.
What about doctor training? Do you see, is doctor training in your future or not yet? Have you thought about that?
Yes, we have thought about that. That is, and actually we are doing something in a few weeks in Oxford for some of the staff and physicians up there as well, broadly around brain health and taking care of your cognitive performance. And
Mm.
we've been doing a little bit more with smaller groups. We still like to keep it small and intimate so that we can combine the the workshop with you get both of us still. We spend a lot of time with people one on one, but we do a little bit of that work ad hoc, I think.
We do, and not everything scales, unfortunately, well. We never work with groups larger than 10. We simply start, it becomes impossible. It requires a completely different approach in larger groups. We can educate, we're keynote speakers on events and do similar things, but that's different to the work that we do with individuals.
Yeah.
I listened to a podcast a few weeks ago, and there was a world famous physician, and he was asked, are you encouraging your kids to get into medicine? And he said, no, doctors are being replaced by AI. Well, a lot of them are, but what you're doing, I don't believe can be replaced by AI. How I interact with patients cannot be replaced
Oh,
with AI.
yeah.
And we've kind of wrapped up. We've gone the listening amount of time that I typically use with this. I've got to tell you, this has been enlightening. I would like to plant a seed to do a whole session on psychedelics. I'd be very curious. I'm curious to learn more. I'm certainly excited to have people that know what they're talking about share, because I think there are people that are just, you know, trying to do psychedelics on their own, and I just don't see good idea.
No, neither do we. Yeah, yeah.
No, because it can do a lot of damage if used incorrectly. Not because they're unsafe in principle, I mean, especially if you're supervised, but because if there is no change in you, let's say in your environment, or you don't know which tools start using and how, you can actually make things worse because you can rapidly reinforce previous patterns that might become even more difficult to eradicate. So again, it's always good to consult with someone who knows what they're doing.
Well, I believe the best investment we can make is our health, and why not start with brain health? Because without that, I'm not sure where we go, but not any place we want to be.
Exactly.
Any final beautiful words to wrap up?
You already have everything you need. Just allow yourself to start with your brain and, the dominoes will fall. Just treat yourself well, sleep, move, rest. That's it.
Mhm.
I think that's beautiful. We'll throw in nutrition too. I like to say the Magnificent Seven: eat right, drink right, think right, move right, sleep right, poop right, talk right. Dr. Matt, any final words before we wrap up this beautiful day?
I think Sarah summarized it very beautifully. Live in a world when we move too little and when we think and process too much. And I think if we could flip that a little bit, it would be a great starting point for most of us.
Yeah.
I love it. Very good. Or I think it's Miyamoto Musashi, the famous samurai, said, think lightly of yourself, think deeply of the world. And that sounds like a pretty reasonable strategy. So, as always, I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski, absolutely knowing that we can all be happy, healthy, and successful. We'll put links in the bio for Dr. Sarah, Dr. Matt. If you have any brain issue, reach out to them first. They're as thorough as anybody I've ever seen. And I'll tell you what, 90 days for great results. I think that's worth investing for you if you're having that challenge. So thank you always, and God bless.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
For having us.